Hello, and thank you so much today for joining us on the topic of a real world use case from around the world utilizing Celo blockchain. Today, I have both with me, Will and James. Thank you so much for both joining. I know you have some presentations prepared for us, some useful information in regards to pilot learnings. Will, if you don't mind, you want to go ahead and do an introduction and then hand it off to James?
Sure. My name is Will. I have been working on the Celo Foundation for about 3 years now, and I lead a team focused on research and innovation, and we do a lot of pilots and experimentation around the world. James? Oh, you're muted, James.
Just a quick mute, unmute. I'm James. I've been working with Celo for about a little bit over two years now. My specialty is last mile finance in Latin America, and I'm going to share a little bit about some boots on the ground during the pandemic and under collateralized lending on Celo.
Wow, that sounds super amazing. I can't wait. You both have presentations prepared for us. Quick intro on my end. I'm Brandy Camacho with Developer Relations. Working on Celo, so all three of us are loving the future of Celo and looking forward to continuing to make an impact. So with that started, if you have any questions for the streamcast, please put them inside the chat channel. We'll be paying attention as we present information. I'll make sure to call out questions, and at the end of the presentation, we'll take additional time for any Q&A and have just a roundtable discussion about the topic points that were presented today. With that said, Will, do you want to kick off a presentation and get it started with pilot learnings?
I would love to. Thanks, Brandy.
Yes. Awesome.
Give me a second to present. Oops. All right, let's see. Tech check. Can you guys see my screen?
Perfect. Looking good.
Awesome. Thanks. So first off, thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to be talking about some of our pilot work couched in this idea of, real use cases from around the world. I think before jumping in, just to comment, like one thing that I love about working on Celo is our mission, which is to, build the conditions of prosperity for all. And that for all piece is very, very important. From the very beginning, we've really tried to get out there, engage with users, and build solutions and products for the less fortunate and underserved. And so today I'm going to talk about two examples of pilots that we've done and how they've evolved, and then try to talk about some lessons from those pilots that you can take forth in your own projects as you continue to build on Celo. So before we kind of jump in, a note about pilots. As you guys might know, pilots are a small and relatively inexpensive way to test your ideas. And my philosophy for pilots are that they should do two things, either prove a point or answer questions, and sometimes both. But if your pilot isn't doing one of these two things, then it kind of begs the question of like, why are you piloting? So in service of either proving a point or answering questions, it's important that all of your pilots should have hypotheses and a methodology to test them out. I don't know why there's a question mark there, but the point stands. So the first pilot that I want to talk about today is actually quite relevant. It was about a year ago. We worked with the Grameen Foundation, and it was funded by JP Morgan. And they wanted to use Celo as a technology to deliver humanitarian aid, COVID relief aid in the Philippines in a manner that is safe and contactless and transparent, and then also lays a groundwork for broader digital financial inclusion. And so our hypotheses in this pilot was, one, Celo is a faster and more affordable way to deliver humanitarian aid. Two, aid delivery on Celo is transparent, and as a result will reduce fraud and graft. And three, this was around usability. Users actually understand how to use digital wallets and are able to receive cryptocurrency for receiving aid. What's important to note here is a lot of the folks in this pilot were relatively low income, had low literacy, and are very new to technology. And so this usability piece was very, very important to test out. I don't have the time to go into a ton of detail, but at a high level, what we essentially did was we onboarded participants with a phone call. On average, this phone call took about 20 minutes. And in that phone call, they downloaded the Valora wallet and kind of answered any questions about the program. Then they received aid. Grameen used a dashboard that we created for them to send CUSD to each wallet. And the recipients could then use that CUSD in one of two ways. They could go online and purchase goods to be delivered to their home, which was great because in the pandemic, a lot of folks have limited mobility. Or they could go into a grocery store. We had a network of grocery stores, I think around 150, that accepted Celo vouchers, Celo CUSD as vouchers for goods in store, which was great because one of the mandates from JP Morgan, the donor, was that aid could only be spent on groceries or medicine. So some quick results. I'm not going to go through this in a ton of detail because the point I want to make here is it's really important to kind of measure the results that match the hypotheses or map to the hypotheses that you test out, because you want to either validate or invalidate them, right? And so as you recall, one of our hypotheses was around usability and the user experience. And so we measured things like onboarding success rate, which was 98%, or the average time for onboarding, which is 19, or how satisfied beneficiaries were, right? For cost and efficiency, we measured things like cost per transaction and benchmarked it against other alternatives that the Grameen Foundation would have used if they weren't using Celo. And so as a result of this project, we ended up getting a lot of buzz and mention in press. So we were featured in a report by the World Economic Forum. Several news outlets published it. And almost more importantly, this also led to additional projects with other NGOs and humanitarian organizations. So organizations like CARE International and Hope for Haiti and several others in the works are now using Celo as a payments rail for aid delivery around the world. And I think this is a strong testament of Celo being on its path to being the blockchain of choice for aid delivery for humanitarian organizations, which I'm very happy about. The second use case I wanted to talk about was a microwork. So we started this pilot a year and a half ago. It was a very small scale, short pilot that has since evolved in a big way. But it started off with this idea of like, what is Celo really good at, right? And we figured out that one thing that Celo technology does better than anything else out there was the ability to send money, small amounts of money, to any mobile phone around the world. And so with that idea in mind, we were like, what could we do with this? And so me and this other engineer, we kind of had this concept of creating an app, a mobile app on your phone that lets you do real tasks and earn real money in Celo in real time, quickly and seamlessly. So our hypotheses here was one, that there's demand for this kind of work. Two, that the work can be done on mobile phones of high quality, basically meeting the quality bar that clients of microwork demand. Three, that Celo is fast and affordable for micropayments. And lastly, people want to earn crypto for microwork. This is something that they desire. And so we built this app in about a week and then kind of flew to Kenya to do a week-long pilot where the design is pretty straightforward. First, people perform work on their phones through this microwork app. The work was pretty straightforward, low-skill work like data annotation or receipt transcription or image labeling. And after they were done completing the work, they could cash out into their Valora wallet and receive CUSD. And then once they receive the CUSD in Valora, they could exchange it for local shillings. In this pilot, since it was a pilot, we had like an agent on the ground physically exchanging CUSD for cash. But in subsequent pilots, once we scaled up, we worked with a partner to make this integration in Valora more seamless. Some results, very successful pilot. The average earnings were about $1 an hour, which doesn't seem like a lot, but for folks in Kenya, the population we worked with, that was a significant improvement. 71% said they would spend more than 5 hours a day using the app if it were available. This pilot only lasted a week, but the average worker spent 24 hours working on this app, which is a big number considering that the vast majority of participants were students who had like school and a full-time job outside of this. So very successful. And we used the success of this pilot to then translate to other projects. So the two things I would note is Mercy Corps has done a pilot similar to this, and results therefore are forthcoming and are looking to kind of use this as a launching point for policymakers to really get a seat at the table to talk about like digital online opportunities as a pathway for economic development. And the World Food Program is now establishing centers and creating a whole program around this, right? So we launched the program in Kenya with a couple hundred folks, and they're looking to scale this up to other countries as well. So it's been a really interesting journey from like small concept of idea to now like these major UN organizations working on using Celo technology to kind of bring economic opportunity to the masses. And so just a thought of like how small pilots that you can test out and prove points to can evolve into something much greater. And so just some final tips for you. First, consider whether you really need a pilot. I recognize that it's kind of ironic that after I spent 10 minutes talking about pilots, I bring this up. But even though pilots are expensive, right? They cost time, they cost money. And if your goals are simple, like, hey, I want to I don't know, test the usability of this certain feature, it might be easier or less painful for you to kind of consider alternative research methods to answer that question. For instance, you could do paper prototypes to interview people, right? So sometimes pilots are necessary, but not always. Number two, focus. So one mistake that I see people very commonly make when designing pilots is trying to do too much, right? I'll see people try to have all these different treatment groups or have all these different things they want to test, and that's great, but like that can really overcomplicate pilots. It's important to kind of really figure out what are the most important objectives or the most crucial questions to answer, and really design your pilot to kind of answer those questions. You can always do more, you can always iterate, but like having a very focused pilot scope is important. Number three, choose your audience wisely. Obviously, you want to kind of make your pilot group as representative of your target consumers or target population as possible. But even within that scope, there's a lot of options here. So I have some philosophies, one of which is extremes and mainstreams. So obviously you want your pilot group to be to have your average folks represented highly, but also consider the extremes of your audience, right? So whether that be age or technical experience, kind of making sure that those are kind of represented are important. And there are also ways to kind of screen to make sure you're getting high quality participants, right? So having like a survey that you send out beforehand that has 10 questions and only selecting folks that fill out the survey can make sure that you're not getting like freeloaders in your pilot. Number four, have a plan and then have a backup plan for that plan. I could give an entire presentation with horror stories of all the pilots that I've run, because when you like do boots on the ground, as James will probably tell you, like things just go wrong all the time. And that's just the nature of pilots. They're very, very messy. Like we've been kicked out of countries before by central bankers that may or may not have wanted a bribe. We've had health scares. Like in our last pilot in Kenya, there was like a tuberculosis scare. And so there's just a lot of things that go wrong. And just be ready and flexible and adaptable. And the last thing is like enjoy the experience. This is something that I forget a lot, but pilots are a lot of work and they're stressful. But for a lot of folks, this is your first time. And for some, maybe the only time that you're going to directly engage with your end users, right? And so I think that's important to note, right? I feel like the projects that have the most empathy for end users tend to be the most successful. And so enjoy that experience. And just want to say thank you for giving me some time to speak today. We've actually written up a whole like write-up about our pilot kit with the lessons and templates, other kind of advice. So you can find that at celo.org/experience/pilots. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. So thank you all. James?
That was amazing.
Sorry.
Before you switch to James, I just want to ask a couple questions. Okay, hope you don't mind. I know, James, you're up next. We're looking forward to the story. But how cool was that? Like you got to sit there and go through this hypothesis, test it out. I'm curious. What was like the emotional feedback of that like 20-minute phone call, trying to coach people to use crypto? That immediate feedback that they have, like, was it emotional? What was it like for them? Was it like really stressful? How was that experience?
Yeah.
for the
So most of the
onboarding?
onboarding calls happen in Tagalog, and I don't speak Tagalog, so I didn't get the direct experience. But for all pilots, we generally have like a user research module where you go and you speak to end users, ask them a lot of questions. And what's great about that is like it adds this qualitative element to what otherwise would be fully quantitative, and you can really get to like the why and the motivations behind people's actions there. And I think that is one of my favorite aspects of pilots, right? Because like understanding the why people do things makes it so it makes it so much more like tangible and more obvious.
And reward, an amazing reward, because you're like, oh my goodness, this is being tested, it's being utilized, we're finally getting some good feedback. This all falls underneath the hood of user research. So we have a hackathon that's going on right now. It's nearing the end, but people are working on those functional prototypes. They're working on the MVPs. They might be reviewing this video. What are the tips when it comes to a pilot? Because it resembles the user research model of developing a product in the first place, right? Like it always starts with your user, what that user story is, what are the core features that you're going to be building out for your minimal viable product, MVP, or the functional prototype.
Yep.
To me, this is directly relates. And it's a testament of why it's so important to connect with your end users. What tips do you have for developers working on projects where they're wondering, how do I get the most valuable information to build as efficiently as possible when I have a time wall in front of me?
Yeah. I mean, I have a ton of tips there, but like I think just at a high level, I would say just as frequent and often as possible to engage with your users, right? Like at any stage from the beginning, you can kind of test out ideas and concepts. If you have things that are more developed, there are ways to kind of get feedback. So the tighter that feedback loop, the more resonant your products will be, right? The last thing you want to do is create a project in an ivory tower and then push it out to like your end users and realize that, oh, this is not what they wanted, right? And so there are ways to cut down on those cycles with like kind of intelligent design of projects and pipelines. And so I think people tend to undervalue user research sometimes. But the thing that separates good projects from great projects is that empathy, that like kind of connection with your end users, in my opinion.
Yeah, the empathy leads to the emotional connection with your use case.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. And so you're talking about basically making sure it's simple versus being complex. And that's a tip that I provide often for folks building in the space. So what's your favorite pilot that you've done thus far? What is your favorite? And then what's the big idea for 2022? Those are my two questions.
You're making me like choose like favorite children a little bit. Like, let's see. I mean, both of the ones I talked about here are near and dear to my heart for various reasons. The Grameen one, because it was like probably one of the hardest pilots I've worked on. It was like fully remote. This had happened right after mainnet launch, and so there were still kind of bugs to figure out. But it was also very impactful, right? Like just talking to like the women that received their money and talking about how they spent it made me realize like this is why I joined Celo, right? Because we're actually making a difference and like people are using this technology for financial inclusion. I also really like the micro work pilot because it's such an obvious use case, right? This is a model of work that wasn't possible before Celo. And so both of these, I think, kind of fit this theme of like, hey, how can this technology be used for real people, for financial inclusion, right? This is something that the blockchain and crypto space has talked about for so long that I'm glad to see that we're adding a little bit to the body of evidence that, this can be a real pathway for change.
Absolutely. It's setting the standard. I mean, we can see the future. So in a sense, we're all futurists, which I love. I love being a futurist. It's like we're in the matrix of our own in crypto world, providing opportunity to folks that otherwise would not have accessible access to this technology. So we're making it accessible, which I love. And to the note that you did on your demonstration, affordable transactions mean a lot for user adoption and the impact of that for social impact. Okay, James, you you heard a little bit about Will and his experience with these pilots, Kenya, Ecuador, super cool. You have an example in regards to Colombia, right? You want to probably segue to your presentation?
Yes. Yeah, and listening to Will, I'd actually love to introduce it a slightly different way. The one of my driving philosophies in pilot design and in research design is making sure that the strategic direction of what you're building, be it a company, a protocol, or what have you, is intimately and dependently connected with your methodology of running pilots and research. And so, like with that context, I'd love to jump into kind of the nitty gritty of a pilot that I ran in right at the beginning of the pandemic, which has gotten a bunch of traction since then and continues to grow. Brandy, are you able to share a presentation for me?
Yes, I'll do it
Thanks.
for you because you asked so kindly. I'm going to go ahead and do it. We have questions. I just want to make sure we're aware. We got 2 questions. We're going to address these questions after the demonstration. Okay?
Wonderful.
Perfect.
All right. So Rhoda is a credit provider for Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. We focus on under-collateralized lending, which has a very high impact on the lives of the recipients. Next slide. Just from like 30,000 feet, I've worked in credit and emerging markets for a number of years right now. And in broad strokes, it's still very broken. The loan shark volume, for instance, just in Colombia exceeds $1 million a day. 2/3 of Latin America are excluded from formal some form of formal financial services. So not all of those are explicitly "quote unquote" unbanked, but they are in some way maligned from credit or from savings or from remittances. And then globally, emerging markets are woefully undercapitalized. The World Bank has published that SMBs, small and medium businesses, are underfunded at a rate of more than $5.2 trillion a year. And that's not even counting the needs for retail, for small people who are trying to borrow money to get a motorcycle or a house. That's just looking at cash-strapped businesses, your little corner tiendas, or farms, or even like small-scale bike manufacturers or other manufacturers who are in the range of like $10,000 to $100,000. Next slide. The drivers of cost in emerging markets really can be boiled down and oversimplified into two different things. The first is the cost of operations, which can account for up to 10 to 15% APR. This is, if you look at traditional microfinance institutions, for instance, they have very, very high costs of, for instance, rural microfinance institutions. They need someone to physically visit their clients on a motorcycle, including gas, depreciation, and salary. That's going to cost them somewhere between 30 and 50 bucks a day, which they need to recover in interest, right? And then the second driver is like a lot of these institutions who are serving vulnerable populations still have relatively analog operations, which have a pretty high risk of fraud and just lost to inefficiencies of inability to analyze data, or costliness of having a back office where you're literally flipping through notebooks to figure out who paid when. And then the second large bucket is the cost of capital. In emerging markets, you have entities like Kiva, who will actually, they'll collect funds in the US or in Europe, and then they will lend them out to small MFI, small microfinance institutions in emerging markets. Kiva, it has lower rates than the other big players in this area. But by and large, when you take country risk into account, when you take currency volatility into account, these MFIs, they're already starting behind because they need to pay someone 8 to 15% annually to be able to maintain that. Another area where credit is costly is loan sharks. So the loan shark market is really interesting to me because it is so decentralized, and it has pros and cons. The pro is that it provides credit to people who need credit. The con is that loan sharks tend to be very, very cash strapped. And so as a product of that, they need to charge really high interest rates to make sure that they're getting effective turnover on their capital. I can answer a lot of questions on loan sharks if people want to. Next slide. Where this leads us is that there's a huge opportunity in formalizing informal markets, right? You look at these loan shark markets and these other failures of formal markets, and the more that you can drive those informal markets towards formalization with organization, with better data quality, the more impact you can make. And so what Rhoda does is we provide transformational loans to excluded people, formalizing informal markets. 98% of our clients are Venezuelan migrants residing in Colombia, though we do also serve Venezuelans residing in Chile, Mexico, Spain, and the United States. We have 3 buckets of loans. Small loans of $50 to $300, which are designed to improve stability. Medium loans for motorbikes or e-bikes to dramatically increase the earnings, and then large loans for motorcycles, which is, it's nicer to ride a motorcycle than it is to ride an e-bike. And so these are about, unlocking long-term goals. Also in this bucket, like in the future, we'd love to include education loans or loans for homes. Next slide. And so as we've built this out, what I really want to dig into for a concept for inspiration with under-collateralized lending is that it doesn't exist. There is no such thing as under-collateralized lending. You are always going to be collateralizing on something. And when you're working with a population that doesn't have collateral to post, they don't have a house to mortgage, you're going to be implicitly collateralizing on their social standing. And next slide. In the traditional, next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. Thanks. In the traditional like fintech world, the 2 paths slide.
Sorry.
All good. So I'll keep going. Yeah. So in the traditional fintech world, you have models like Celo or Branch, and basically what they will do is they will take the metadata from your phone and make a social graph of what your standing is within a social graph. This is an inherently extractive process because you're taking something that people have created. Like, people have created strong personal bonds, and you are effectively collateralizing loans based on those social bonds without giving the client an upside to what you're doing. The way that we philosophically differ from that is that we want to make that good behavior in your social circle much more explicit. And this is particularly important with a migrant population where they have been pushed out from institutions. They can't rely on the state. Like, all they really have is the community around them. And the more that you can align with building these bonds in community, the more that you can de-risk your portfolio, having the end result of lower interest rates for migrants. And this is something that we believe is uniquely possible on Celo and crypto in general. Next slide. Talking a little bit about where we are right now. the increase in earnings across all of our clients has recently crossed $1 million with over 800 loans total. And we've been growing at a cadence of 22 to 25% growth month over month since August, and keeping on that path. Next slide. And what this has shown to us, coming back to where I kicked this off, is by building a system which you can learn from, you can continuously iterate on the product that you're building and the people that you're trying to serve. Because we are liable for this relationship with our clients, we're pushed to really focus on the data that is critical to building a better product. What this is showing us right now is what we're going to be deploying next, which is these explicit incentives for good behavior. So four of these example areas are referrals, which would be a relatively low bonus, fiadores, which I'll close on, savings behavior, again, like a relatively low bonus, and then improving financial literacy is also something that we would want to promote. Serving as a fiador is something that's really unique to credit, because we can basically have someone make a recommendation for a client and then put a deposit on that recommendation. And for us as the loan originator, we would happily pay you out like 50 to 100% APY on that deposit because of the strength of that recommendation. Having access to programmable money concretely decreases operational costs. And this is where we see the future going for under collateralized lending on crypto. In closing, I'm just thinking about like where this leads us with credit in general. They're kind of like three tracks that I see developing over the next 10 to 15 years. The first is to build tools which improve individual communities and the relationships between individual communities. The next is like, if you imagine that little family group or that little community, having an on-chain credit history means that you can more easily jump between communities, right? So all it takes is like one or two people in that community to be able to cross over into another local community. And then lastly is this concept of global communities or delegated debt. We kind of tend in the US or Europe to look at peer-to-peer markets and peer-to-peer lending as this kind of like hands-off process. We're like, yeah, like I'll loan $300 to some farmer in Tanzania and see what happens. Fundamentally though, a loan is about building a relationship. And that relationship has to do with the person who's receiving the money, but also the person who is lending the money. And so having these like semi-intermediaries is actually very, very useful, where I can interact directly with the client. I can provide, financial education to them. I can worry about cash in, cash out. But you, as an external observer, you living in Europe or San Francisco or New York, you can look and you can say, hey, like this loan issuer, like we can see the responsibility of their clients from on-chain payment data, and we want to make an impact loan to them, right? We want to make a loan to this pool of capital because we know that it's going to be quickly distributed to people and have a high impact. And the benefit here is that we start getting at this underfunding problem in emerging markets, this gap of $5.2 trillion by making the bridges between countries a lot lower, like lower barrier to entry. We can make them much more accessible. Yeah, that's where I see this going. And it's a real pleasure to be able to build this on Celo and be surrounded by so many people in different markets and different contexts who can uh, who I can commiserate with on, building in emerging markets, right? This whole thing like unfolded in the pandemic, and I can tell like Will, you know, arriving in Colombia like the first week of March 2020, and like, oh my God, I gotta figure something out yesterday. And then like the borders closing behind me. But it's been a real pleasure to build, and yeah, open to questions if there are any.
Awesome. Did we miss a slide? Because I noticed we had another slide here for how we build this.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, those were my closing comments on like the improving communities by making these connections stronger, moving between communities by jumping between them, and then these global communities by looking into like delegated risk, delegated credit, and these ways to lower barriers to access.
Amazing. Really well done. Like this to me, between the both of you, what a fantastic story on access and accessibility. Access to credit markets that are often neglecting the global community, not fair in regards to the approach for accessibility, loan sharks, what friction, that's also unfair because in a sense it's taking advantage of the underrepresented communities that are there. Some of the things that you touched base on was we have $5.2 trillion that's not being represented appropriately. And it seems that there's a potential credit expense cost of 30%, up to 30% between the loan sharks and the creditors. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. Like, why are these loan sharks taking advantage of these people? And why have they been unrepresented for so long?
Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack there. So the 30% that I'm talking about here is that's focused on like microfinance institutions, right? So that's 30% is actually very low in comparison with interest rates in emerging markets in general. Loan sharks are going to charge 20 to 35% of principal over a week over a month in Colombia. And so that works out to 400 to 500% annual, which is just absolutely wild. And I know some like loan sharks who have very good hearts, and like they're just trying to make a living. Like some of them are quite bad, but like understanding it from their perspective, like they have a pool of like $3,000 and they're trying to make a living off of that. If you imagine better coordination and better access for people who are excluded, if you're managing a larger pool of capital, your operational costs come way down, and so you can start to reach those excluded people.
So it sounds like that they're open, that there's loan sharks out there that have some ethics where they feel for the community and they're willing to adapt, utilizing new technology to potentially reduce their rates.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. That's amazing. That part I'm looking forward to because it's horrendous. We've seen it all over the whole world. It's not just in these emerging markets, but even in for instance, United States, people will get these payday loans and they too are being taken advantage. It's the same process, but in a different region. Will, jumping back to you, we had some questions from the audience. We got about 4 questions right now from them. The very first question was, how do you think about whether or not the outcomes of your pilot will apply to broader populations in different cultural contexts? Good question.
It is a really good question. And it's a tricky one because my answer is going to be it depends, which is I know people don't love to hear. But I will say, like, you can't ever completely separate out the cultural lens from research, right? Like, whether you're doing research in the US or in a different country, there's always going to be that cultural element that permeates. And so the first step is having that awareness. I'd also kind of wonder like who are you hoping to kind of serve? If you're hoping to build your solution for like just the US, or then I think that cultural piece matters less, and if you focus your population in that country. But there are ways for you to kind of test things out, right? And so if you're trying to build for a solution for a culture of which you're not a part of, say like like you're like American like myself, but you want to build something for Kenyans. I think it's important to kind of have that more research as much as possible to kind of close that loop and have that empathy, and also work with folks that know better. So every pilot that we've ever done abroad, we've hired a local fixer that basically helps us navigate that like environment, which I think is very crucial. And if you are looking to build something for a global audience, I would encourage you to build multiple pilots around the world to kind of really get that broad perspective. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Good tips, good tips. And then the next question, which relates in a sense, is more on the lines of completing the task in the Celo pilot. Who pays these folks? They want to know about the funding.
Yeah. So these are real tasks paid for real people. So for this pilot, we basically worked with this micro provider called Appen. There's like a platform, and we got old tasks from them and basically paid at the rate those old tasks were. So that was just because it was a pilot. Like we didn't really care about it being live. But for the subsequent projects that have been scaled up with the World Food Program or Mercy Corps, these were like live work. And so that was live work that was being paid by organizations like, big tech companies that need someone to clean their data or to kind of like, help build machine learning algorithms. So, yeah.
And plus that there's grants, there's so much social good that goes on globally. Folks that are not even in the blockchain space, but they're interested in making an impact. There's donors out there that actually care, and it's super nice to have these folks help support these initiatives, because it's important. Like this accessibility issue that we've had, I mean, it's about time in our technologically advanced world that we finally resolve these issues. I'm surprised it's taking this long. But with that said, hey, let's switch over to James. Says James, there's a question for you in regards to how are they receiving their funds in Colombia? Do they need to convert to fiat? So they kind of about the conversion and the off-ramp. Do you want to shed some light on that?
Yeah. So yes, I mean, yeah, the answer is that fiat is super useful. It is the driving thing. We find utility as the issuer to do both issuing and collections in crypto, and facilitating that transaction, because it gives us clean data, which we will, long term be able to use for lowering our cost of capital.
So the conversion, is that a hard part for folks to understand how to convert, how they off ramp, or was there somebody in the middle that helps facilitate that friction? Was there friction? Maybe a little bit more depth on that.
I mean, so this is an active and ongoing process, right? So this is still live. We're still actively growing, and right now, like we run cash in, cash out. There aren't any providers in Colombia who are ready to do it, and we see an operational benefit to facilitating that, because it gives us face time with our clients and lets us learn from them. That said, we have recently hit a revenue mark where cash collection is a security risk. And so we're pushing for, more and more digital payments. And as of last week, we finally hit 75% digital payments and only 25% physical payments.
Amazing. Well, understanding the friction and these potential problems with cash in, cash out, it's just a primary example of why we need to do these initiatives with pilots and so forth, to acquire the information, utilize that with user research, establish sound partnerships with folks that are missionally aligned.
Yeah, and I would say that I would add too that, like, you don't have to have every single block in place to run a pilot. that now we're managing a volume where we can lean on other cash in cash out providers in Colombia, to be able to offload a bunch of that work to them. And so that's actually something that's really great building in Celo is we do have a lot of these emerging partnerships in around the world, where one alliance member has worked with one grant recipient, or and they're like all these different infrastructure blocks are starting to come into place. And so there's a huge amount of collaborative fervor over making sure that drives forward, and means that yes, you might feel alone when you're working in an emerging market, but way less so by having a community around you who's driving the same direction.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned that. I'm curious, Will, do you find that experience the same on your end?
Which piece specifically?
With the frictions, working with the local communities, establishing the presence, the cash in, cash out, the whole experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that James said that really resonated was you don't have to have it perfect. You don't have to have all the pieces figured out for a pilot. It's an iterative, messy process. And so, yes, there definitely are frictions, but that is kind of par for the course. Yeah. And that's actually what I find kind of fun, that messiness. So yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's frictions, but also kind of learnings a little bit, right? I don't know. How do I put it? Everything makes sense on paper, right? Everything just kind of works when you're in an office in San Francisco. But when you get into the field, then you start to realize that a lot of your assumptions are just incorrect, right? And so, for an example, when we did our one of our first pilots in the Philippines, we asked what was the average download speeds of phones, right? And that was 8 megabytes per second, right? And so from our test in San Francisco, 8 megabytes per second was fine. Everything worked fine at 8 megabytes per second. But once we got to the Philippines, we realized that 8 megabytes per second was a fake number. It actually ranged from 3 to 12, right? And at 3, when it rained, things just broke down. But you don't get that insight when you are in San Francisco. It's actually really hard to simulate that. So it's into the field where you realize that there's a lot of gray area and messiness that I think really kind of battle test the solutions you're trying to build.
Yeah, don't underestimate the effect of rain on cell phone speeds. Yes, hard. Yeah, oh my God. No, sorry, I can't talk by WhatsApp right now. It's raining.
Oh, that's so interesting. And the latency too. It's you might have what appears to be a good connection speed until you look into the latency. When there's high latency, that's going to impact the connection.
Yeah. So and there's really small things that you don't realize. Language makes a huge difference on how people use things. And until you think folks, if you call something pay a friend versus send a friend, it makes a huge difference in behavior. These are just insights that you don't really think about when you're just working in an office, and you only get if you get out there and talk to folks.
And another great reason why, if you're in a hackathon, you should be really thinking about the user story at full circle. How did they start? How does it complete the task in regards to the core components of the features for your product offering? Super important not to just do one user role, but to get research done on multiple user roles. So that way you can understand and potentially be prepared for things like connectivity issues with high latency. Super interesting. We have one more question here I want to address from Josh. This is related to Colombia. So James, you don't mind answering this one. It says, are the users in Colombia in a general area where Venezuelans have settled? Example, we serve a lot of refugees crossing in, I can't pronounce that, Kusha, I'm so sorry. But they continue walking towards, Jane, can you pronounce these words? I'm so bad with these things. I had to take speech therapy when I was younger. So if anybody wants to make fun of me, go ahead. I had to go to those dang trailers to learn how to speak this stuff. I could use assistance here, but it looks like it's about the immigration and people settling. Maybe you can shed some light on there and help me pronounce these things correctly. Thanks, James.
Yeah, Cucuta. Yeah, super interested, Josh, in connecting async on this. Yeah, that's an incredibly specific question. So, for those not as empapa, for those of you who are not as tied up in the potato, as Josh, 6 million Venezuelans have resettled since roughly 2014, 2015. A lot of them who have migrated in the past 4-ish years have migrated in much more precarious situations, and so they're walking. Cucuta is the border city, and then they walk on from Cucuta to Bucaramanga, and then from there to Bogota. From Bogota, a lot of them continue to resettle. They'll either make a shot for Lima or Chile in Lima, Peru, or Santiago, Chile. Yeah, I mean we're based in Bogota, but expanding to other cities in the next few months, and more than happy to get in contact about that, Josh.
In other words, it sounds like it's just a challenging situation in general.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why we need to do these fantastic pilots to experiment and drive real solutions that are meaningful in regards to global impact. Super good work, both of you. Thank you so much for joining. Will, James, really love not only your energy, but the dedication to be impactful on this. It's so inspired me. I hope it inspires the viewers out there. Well done, you two. Thank you for joining up today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you for having us.
A pleasure.
All right.
Yeah,
have a good one. Bye-bye.